Many of the state agencies that had to administer this weren't particularly interested in doing so. And the local governments that had to do this in order to get federal grants for infrastructure and a variety of different things weren't that interested, but they all prepared plans. I got a job about that particular point in time, a little later, because of all the 701 planning assistance. But let me leave, no, I do want to mention the Florida Development Commission, because they did say something about the state agencies. The federal government and the 701 program required a state agency to administer the 701 assistance program. And that happened to be the Florida Development Commission. What had happened was that the Florida State Planning Office had become the Florida State Improvement Commission, which had become the Florida Development Commission. Well, that Florida Development Commission, either is up there or still is up there, reluctantly administered the 701 program, reluctantly, but they wanted to get the money down to the local governments. So we were back on board in terms of at least a developing interest in planning on a statewide basis as well as the nation as a whole. Earl?
Okay, I'm sure Senator Graham will remember Baker versus Carr. States in the early 60s, late 50s were very badly apportioned. Dade County, with over 1 million people, was represented on a ratio of 1 representative to 300,000 people. Counties like Baker County were represented, every 300 people had a representative in Tallahassee. The Miami Herald called it the days of the pork choppers. When the Supreme Court in 1962 came down with its provision that the standard would be 1 person, 1 vote. Well, that really had an impact on Florida and 49 of the other states because they were all malapportioned. The rural folks had figured out a long time ago politically how to control the states. Urban areas like South Florida or even Northeast Florida were not part of their agenda. It was not there. The last part of US 27 improved from an old 2-lane road was from South Florida from Central Florida into Miami. Otherwise, it was a fine highway everywhere else in the state. Well, Senator Graham will remember that because he went to Tallahassee with a group of wonderful, young, energetic, urban legislators. And that changed state government. The Constitution was changed. That group of wonderful people reorganized state government so it was not a little piece of this and a little piece of that and so on and so forth. There were hundreds of commissions and committees and whatever. And all of them had a little separate budget that the legislature would give them. Well, that made a big difference. Reapportionment, in my judgment, was that which made moved Florida into the 20th century. The Florida story in the 1970s was a direct result of these very thoughtful, creative people who went to Tallahassee. And the election of RuBino and Earl from Pensacola. Matter of fact, he grew up in Oklahoma. But Askew succeeded Governor Claude Kirk. Well, the Kirk administration had the good fortune of having on board a fellow named Nathaniel Pryor Reed, who had done a lot of groundwork which ultimately made the state recognize the environment. It took us a long time in Florida to understand that there was a natural system out there somewhere that we had to worry about. Up to that point, nobody concerned themselves with the environment. Even Congress didn't recognize it until 1969. There was a drought in South Florida. Governor Askew called a conference on the water management in 1971. It met in Miami Beach. And it made a host of recommendations, one of which there was a need for statewide planning. Another of which there was a need for a system of statewide water management. Governor Askew thoughtfully created a task force to respond to those recommendations from that very large citizen group of 150 people. That group recommended, and Senator Graham served with Dick and I on that, if I recall. That group recommended 4 pieces of legislation: the Environmental Land and Water Management Act, the State Comprehensive Planning Act, the $240 million Bond Recreation and Land Conservation Act, which is the first large investment in acquisition of environmentally endangered lands, Water Management Resources Act, which created the 5 water management districts, all of which I'm sure you've heard of wherever you live, of one or the other of the water management districts. So then we had to implement that stuff. I was asked by the governor's office to head the then created state planning office. We were empowered and required to write a state comprehensive plan. We were required to create the guidelines for the designation of areas of critical state concern. Those are areas of concern because of historical value, because of environmental value, because of archaeological value, or because of public investment. The designation of such by the governor and cabinet had to meet those criteria in order that the state would designate. Because what happened is when it was designated, the local governments virtually had no more planning authority. So it wasn't a fun game. The development of regional impact, I'm sure anybody who reads the newspapers know about development of regional impact. The creation of regional planning councils, that was an interesting problem. We recommended to the governor 10. There were 10, and then finally there were 11, and so on. And those were created because it was simple. It was required by the law to have some agency review regional developments of impact. Our strategy was to tell the counties, who would have to be the basic members of those regions, that if they weren't willing to create regional and cooperate and create regional planning councils, we were going to let the Department of Pollution Control review the developments. That did not set well with local governments. Okay, the main thing that came out of those acts was the 1975 Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act. That was a product of the Environmental Land Management Study Committee. The first one. John DeGrove headed that committee, as I recall. No, we didn't. That was,
that was Dan O'Connor.
no, it was a lawyer.
I'm sorry.
Alan
I
Millage.
was thinking about him.
Dan was the staff.
Staff director.
Okay, that's the end of my story.
Mind you, and I think most of you people realize that what was being done in the 1970s, really, we couldn't look at another state and say, well, we're modeling after that particular state, or we're trying something they've tried and they've learned these things from. It was all quite brand new. And as things unfolded from the early 1970s and into 1975 with the Local Planning Act, didn't quite unfold like some of us anyway in the early 1970s thought it should in terms of state involvement and intergovernmental system, state involvement, regional involvement, and the the local planning act, and it was part of that. By that particular point in time, we didn't get as far with regional planning as we had hoped to. The Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act was passed somewhat differently than John DeGrove and a number of other people would have liked to have seen it. Most of his things were in there, but yet there were some weaknesses as well. So we had a partially evolved system. When Governor Graham came to office, now Senator Graham, basically it was my understanding that he was fairly dissatisfied with what was happening at that particular point, that not enough had been done. So he began to create some committees that would begin to move toward this and have a new approach to attempting to put this whole system together. At the very same time, we had H.V. Moffett setting up a House Select Committee on Growth Management back in about 1982. The point I want to get to here is that we had the executive branch moving in a direction, and we had the legislative branch moving in the same direction. And the two together, when we get to the middle 1980s in terms of the 1984 Act, 1985 and 1986 Acts. Not to say that there weren't some difficulties in between, but those were worked out because they were both moving in the same direction. Same thing had occurred in the early 1970s when things were put together. The legislature had been moving, Governor Askew has been moving, they were both moving down the same set of tracks, they brought that rail together. That's a very important thing. It doesn't always happen. Those windows of opportunity were there at that point in time. So we bring ourselves into the 1980s, and we have the new state comprehensive plan promulgated. That was 1984. The first plan had taken a number of years to complete, and so they decided at that point in time, we're going to have it ready within a year. Not only within a year, within 5 months, that plan was put together, that state comprehensive plan that we have today. We had a new improved Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act that we all relate to or work with or work under, and you had that responsibility an awful lot as DCA Secretary. A vastly improved plan. Some lessons learned from 1975 to 1985 that were implemented in 1985. After the enactment of the Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Development Regulation Act, and also particularly after the new state comprehensive plan was enacted, we had the ZWIP committee appointed by the legislature. And the ZWIP committee, headed by a Miami banker, was charged with calculating the cost of implementing the comprehensive state plan, finding ways to pay for those costs. Well, they found a way, at least for a few months. Some funds were collected for about 4 months in there until Governor Martinez was faced with pressures from the news media as well as everyone else, to sort of reverse that law, and it was quickly reversed. So all the monies that had been hopefully were being collected to go to help local governments in terms of meeting their infrastructure needs just plain disappeared, and they have basically disappeared since then. So that's one of the issues, the major issues in terms of attempting to implement our planning here in Florida and our growth management here in Florida.
Lessons learned. You there?
Let me say one thing about lessons learned. We're going to jump into some of our conclusions, because what we do is to set up what were the lessons learned, at least that we feel, and actually, when I look back, I find a lot more in the pages. Lessons partially learned, which Earl and I are not going to treat this evening, and lessons not learned, which we will treat. But those of you who picked up a book, you will see that it's lessons learned with a big question mark. So we were beginning, to write the book with that title in mind, and saying, hey, we know we've learned some lessons. We know we've done over the years a lot of good in planning and growth management in Florida. But there's a lot that hasn't been learned, and there's a lot that has been ignored.
Okay. Lesson learned. The one lesson we learned is land acquisition was a very important policy decision on the part of the state. Today, in Florida, 39 million acres of state land, including water,